Now, in this series, we're talking about active and engaged learning. This should be a goal for all of our classrooms, especially when we start thinking about lectures. Now, what are we talking about here? Well, I want you to think about this quotation, which I've seen in numerous sources. Now, you see, if all we're after is this type of transfer of information, it can be done a lot more effectively than through lecture. Just hand out the notes to the students. But if we want more from learning than that, then we have to think of effective ways to do it. So given that, what should our focus be? Is it presenting information, or are we talking about student mastery and retention of information? Or another way to look at it is we want the students to comprehend the content we present. Now, I realize that I've set up to some degree a false dichotomy between presenting content and mastering content. I know that students cannot master something that has not been presented to them. And I know that none of you are content with just spouting off with a lot of stuff and not caring if students understand any of it. But I fear that all too often the result of what we do in the classroom tends more toward emphasizing presentation instead of mastery. We need to remember that learning is not a spectator sport. Students do not learn much just by sitting in class, listening to teachers, memorizing prepackaged assignments, and spitting out answers. They must talk about what they're learning. They must write about it and relate it to their experiences and apply it to their daily lives. They must make what they learn part of themselves. This is a quote from an article by Eisen, which I'll give the citation for at the end of this presentation. Now, I want to clarify. I'm not just talking about the kids being busy. There are plenty of ways to keep them busy, but which don't lead to real learning. After all, we know about the word busy work. And we're not just talking about classes where all the students are on task, where they're not distracted doing other things. I mean, students can be on task and focused on the lesson and still not really learning it. Instead, what we want is to see classes where students are active in doing things. It might mean they're up out of their seats working on projects. It might mean they're actively involved in instruction in some other way. But the focus is on student action and student work. But what makes this different from busy work is that the students need to be thinking about what they're doing. In busy work, students are doing something like copying a spelling list 10 times without ever thinking about those words. They can put their mind on autopilot, just copy the words over and over, and their mind is a million miles away. Or they can mindlessly copy teacher notes from the PowerPoint without having any idea what those notes mean or how to apply the teaching. Instead, we want them to give serious thought to understanding what they're doing. Why is this happening when I do that experiment? How does this point in the lecture relate to what I read last night? Why is this word spelled that way? You see, real learning doesn't take place just because something goes into a student's working memory, where he uses it to copy notes or spelling words. Nor does it take place in short-term memory, where he puts facts to remember for the test next period, cramming. Real learning happens when the student is using information in short-term memory to make connections and to apply to what's in his long-term memory, things he already knows. When those neural pathways are developed, the student is truly learning the material. Our goal as teachers needs to be finding ways to push students into consciously thinking this way about what we teach. That's active engagement with the content. There's many ways to do this, such as project-based learning or discovery learning, but here's the thing. We're still going to have lectures, including other forms of direct instruction, where the teacher is basically communicating the information to the students. We're not going to a complete discovery-based learning model. So how can we deliver our lectures and direct instruction in a way that keeps students actively engaged? One way is to think about this as an interactive lecture. Let's see some differences between a traditional lecture and an interactive lecture. In the traditional lecture, the teacher talks and the students listen with few interruptions. In the interactive lecture, the teacher talks with regular pauses for structured activities. In a traditional lecture, we generally notice students starting to lose focus after about 10 or 15 minutes. In the interactive lecture, when student interest begins to wane, there's a planned activity to maintain interest. How does the teacher ask questions? In a traditional lecture, most questions are rhetorical. The teacher answers his own questions. And when he does want students to answer, it's usually done by students raising their hands and the teacher calling on one of them. In an interactive lecture, the teacher expects students to answer his questions, and he might be using a student response system like clickers or Poll Everywhere or Socrative, personal whiteboards. We'll talk about this in a minute. The teacher wants to get all of the students actively involved in answering his questions. In a traditional lecture, students listen quietly and individually take notes. Student-to-student talk is discouraged. In an interactive lecture, student-to-student talk is encouraged, and students regularly work in pairs or in groups. In a traditional lecture, very little attempt is made to systematically check for student comprehension, and few opportunities are provided during the lecture for correction of misunderstanding. In the interactive lecture, comprehension is regularly and systematically assessed, and students have regular opportunities to get misunderstandings corrected. So let's look at some ways to make a lecture into an interactive lecture. Now here's what I'm not talking about doing. Giving students handouts of notes with blanks for them to fill in, usually while you use a PowerPoint with those blanks filled in. Now I know why you do it. You can be sure the students have the right answer. You can avoid students wondering what the main points of the lectures are. It gives them something to use to prepare for the test. All they have to do is memorize those notes. But what's the problem here? Students invariably don't have to think at all beyond just having part of their mind following along as you talk, so they hear the words on the page and then know what goes in the blank. And then you have students looking on each other's papers. Wait, what goes in that blank? Did you get that word? How do you spell it? Or you have the student who misses class, just gets a copy of the friend's notes and fills in the blanks. He's not even thinking about it. He's just copying the right words in the blanks right down the page. But you see, now this gets back to our opening slide. The lecture becomes transferring your notes to the student notes without information passing through their brain. If all you want is for them to have the right specific words in their notes, just give them the completed notes and save them the trouble. If you want students to think about the content, which we should all want, this is not the way to do it. So if we're not going to do this, how do we get students to take notes and think about the content? One easy way to do this is the pause procedure. Every 8 to 10 minutes, pause your lecture. Give the students a couple of minutes to jot down notes. Research tells us that the brain can only handle about 10 minutes of lecture before it needs to process that information. Pausing gives the students' minds time to do that. You might encourage them to turn to someone else to rework or to fill out their notes at that point. Or use the Cornell system, illustrated here. They divide their paper into 3 sections. On the right, they take traditional notes while you're talking or complete them during your pause time. In the left column, they add things like questions they have about the notes, applications, or other things that might not be literally in the lecture. Then, during the pause at the bottom of the page, they note the key point of the lecture at that point. What's the main idea? These notes will help review when it comes time to study the notes. But you see, the students are thinking about all of this. They're having to work through it mentally. A similar technique is the think, pair, share method every 10 minutes or so. Just stop lecturing and ask a question about what you just said. It could be something as simple as, what were the 2 main points to remember about triangle measurements? Or something like, think to yourself, how do you think this doctrine of total depravity relates to the idea that unbelievers often do good things? Give the students 30 seconds or so to think. Then say, now, turn to one person near you and both of you share your idea with each other and help each other if you need to. Give them about a minute. Then say, okay, what were the 2 main points? Johnny and Billy. Call on some pair who just discussed it together. Then move on with your lecture. Again, the idea here is giving them time to mentally process the lecture content. You can also use student response systems. The idea here is to check frequently during the lecture to see if the students are understanding you, rather than waiting until the end of the lesson and saying, anyone have any questions? Or, it's better than just hoping students will interrupt you with a question. They're not going to do that. Instead, you want to force them to let you know whether they understand or not. And you want to check all student understanding, not just the 1 or 2 students you might ask a question to. There's several ways to do this. Students could have personal marker boards, and they write a quick answer and then all hold up their boards. You take a quick look around the room to see who got it and who didn't. You could use yes/no signs. You could use multiple choice cards for the same thing. You also have dedicated student response systems, or clickers. With our BYOD program, you can use things like Socrative or Poll Everywhere to get some quick feedback. Again, the idea is that you know throughout your lecture whether the students are getting things or not. You could use brief in-class writings. Every 10 minutes or so, pause and say, okay, write 1 paragraph summarizing what we just said about the Christian faith of Robert E. Lee. Then, allow just 1 or 2 minutes. You can collect these or not. The point is that having them write gets the students thinking about and processing what you just said in the lecture. So, that's the main point here. We want our students to be thinking while we're lecturing and processing the information, not just feeding it into their notes without them having to think. So, you want to think of ways. These are some suggestions that you can make your lecture or any time of direct instruction more interactive, to get students actively engaged in their learning rather than just passively receiving what you say, or more accurately, just a portion of what you say. Here are the 2 sources that I used for this material, and I would encourage you, if you want more information, to look these up.